thank you all for your time and your patience today. It's been very valuable. It's been a little heavy, but such is the situation. Our final panel today is on the global and the American challenges. The idea was to go from Ukraine to the region to global and America and tie it back. We also want to take this opportunity to mention some of our local communities, community leaders, and give them a chance to say something as well. So those of you, we'll grab Myron and everybody back, or whoever's happy from the different groups, to say a few words for sure and share with everybody what your group's doing and what we can do to help you. With that being said, our first speaker today, it looks like Mónika Palotai.
Thank you so much for staying here. So the global challenges, I'm mainly going to talk about the European Union and its main challenge, how to get the money to pay for refugees and how to get the money for energy and for everything else that is related to the war. The topic and the question sometimes is controversial because some people feel it's just not the right time to ask that where the EU, where the member states are going to get the money. However, it's really important to see that it's a war of attrition, just like some panelists in the previous panel said that. And it's a war of attrition as well when it comes to the European Union and funding refugees and funding the energy crisis as well. And for us and for everybody, it's really paramount to know what kind of challenges the EU and therefore the global community is facing, because whatever is happening in the European Union and whatever is happening in Ukraine, as we can see, it really affects global policy making and the global community. It is an armed conflict that has plunged Europe in a horrible refugee crisis that is unprecedented since the Second World War. We all know that, but the fighting still goes on, and we heard the question when it is going to end. Nobody knows that. I mean, I don't know anybody, and I've been talking to a lot of policymakers in Washington, D.C. Nobody knows the answer, and as we have heard, not even diplomats. Around 8 million people forced to flee their homes and seek refuge in foreign lands. 1/3 of Ukraine's pre-war population have been displaced since the invasion. By March 20th, 1/4 of the population of Ukraine had fled the country. 90% of the refugees are women, children, and men between the ages 18 and 60 cannot leave the country unless they have 3 or more children. So these are the basic data that we all should keep in mind. And the war has triggered 3 major policy shifts in the European Union. The first one, that the European Union allowed Ukrainians to enter the EU, live, and work there. The Council of the European Union activated the 2001 Temporary Protection Directive. Nayla Rush is going to talk further about the American and the European system and how it works and explain the mechanism. This is a kind of de facto Schengen. This is brand new, and the European Union didn't even open that possibility in the previous migration crisis in 2014-15. So that is a huge policy shift. And the second one, which is again very important and significant shift, the EU for the first time provided military assistance, including billions in lethal weapons to a third country during active conflict. Never happened before. And the third one that we can all feel globally, everybody, every single person, that there is an existential crisis in the EU, an energy crisis. Everybody around the globe can feel the consequences of it. That's the third major policy shift as the European Union and its member states trying to wean off Russian energy. The European Union and its member states so far spent 67 billion euros. That is approximately 71 billion US dollars on assistance, military aid, and support for refugees or any kind of assistance. That means that the European Union and the 27 member states. It's 37.8 billion in economic assistance, 17 billion in support for refugees, and 12 billion in military support. Now you can see that two of these covers the two policy shifts I was talking about earlier. I'm not going to go deep into details, but how the European Union covered and got all that money is simply just source redirection. It's kind of impossible to get 67 million euros just from one day to another. So it made its system more flexible and broadened its framework and allowed member states to use the existing initiatives and funds to use it for other reasons, for example, helping refugees or military assistance or any kind of other assistance. If you're interested, I'm happy to answer or explain how all this framework works. And also the European Investment Bank opened up credit lines as well for member states to use it. So there are lots of initiatives, but the main thing is that the sources already existed. They just redirected and reframed how it can be used in the existing framework. Three directions where the refugee crisis relief cost will go through or it will be distributed. First of all, it goes to the receiving countries to cover the direct and indirect costs. Second is the relief assistance in Ukraine. And the third one, it's further down in the future, but it's relief and support for returning to Ukraine and the reconstruction. We cannot really separate all three, so we cannot really, when we're talking about cost, we cannot only focus on how much it costs in the countries, in the frontline countries, because we have to also calculate in, and it's a broader perspective, not everybody agrees with that, but this is my personal opinion. But when we're talking about tackling the crisis, we also need to consider the cost that the European Union and any other country provides for Ukraine to help and assist IDPs or to help people to stay or able to remain in their houses. What in two panels before, my colleague Christoph showed you that it's a very torn down and ruined areas. And the third one, and also we have to calculate it in the cost, that how much it is going to be in the future, how much it is going to cost to reconstruct the country and to rebuild the country. Because Ukraine, in order to successfully rebuild the country, will need to have its own people back. Otherwise, it's going to be kind of impossible. As I told you, most of the people who fled, that 8 million people, are mainly women and children, and Ukraine cannot really lose that generation, or these generations rather. And when we're talking about frontline countries, here we can see how many people fled to the neighboring countries and to any other countries in the European Union as share of population. And you can see that Estonia took most of the refugees in share of population, and the second was the Czech Republic. And in total, Poland was the country that took most of the refugees in, and the second is Germany. Now, I guess it's very important to talk about the challenges and implications, what the refugee crisis means, and cost-wise. When I started this panel, I mentioned this is a war of attrition, and the European Union is dried up as well. It needs to provide that much of money and even more. There are estimates that the refugee crisis at the end is going to cost about 36 to 40 billion US dollars, which is a huge amount of money. Now, the other issues and challenges that the EU, the European Union, is going to face is employment, how to integrate Ukrainian refugees. That's really a crucial question. There is a shortage at the moment in most of the member states, and in a medium term, it could boost economic growth, and it could generate tax revenues, and of course, it could ease market tightness. But there are issues as well: how to integrate people, how to give them license, how to comply with the European Union standards, how to use their diplomas in the European Union. There are lots of questions. And also, when it comes to employment, we have to consider the fact that it's mainly women and children. So women need to work, children need to go to schools. That's also an issue when it comes to employment. And it's mainly single mothers, since the men had to stay back in Ukraine and fight for their countries. Now here comes the third point that I already mentioned, and that's the reconstruction. And it could be around, the latest estimates, around $1 trillion that it will cost. And of course, the longer the war goes on, the more it will cost. That's pretty much self-evident. And refugee integration is going to be really central to successful rebuilding. So countries, member states, really have to work on cooperating with Ukraine, how to manage to get human resource and civilians back to Ukraine whenever it's possible. But in certain cases, it's just not doable. As I mentioned earlier, we just returned from Ukraine a couple of weeks ago, and when you go to villages, it's not even that evident in the cities, but when you go to villages, there's really nothing. You cannot really send people back, even though there is a tendency that people are going back. And when we ask them that, why do you go back? The answer what we got is, because grandma is there, because grandpa is there, because the house, because this is where I grow up. So people, NGOs and member states also need to help refugees settling back to Ukraine, and that's also going to be part of that cost as well when we're calculating the finances. I'm talking about 1 trillion at the moment, but if we're checking the numbers back in December, and it's February, it's end of February now. Back in December, it was only 641 billion. So in 2 months, that's almost doubled. So we can come back to the question that when the war ends, we don't know, but definitely the reconstruction costs and reintegration of Ukrainian refugees to the society is going to be even more costly and more difficult. And the last one, and the biggest challenge that the European Union and the global community is going to face, is energy crisis. I know it may seem that it's not related to the refugee crisis, but when I come back to the war of attrition, you might read the news over the summer when energy prices peaked and all the member states were rushing to get LNG or filling up their resources for the winter. It really raised some question in the member states and among the population as well, that should we support Ukraine? Should we support the people? And there were some voices as well that it's enough to have refugees in Europe. So the biggest challenge in energy crisis is energy crisis in many ways. And also it has an effect supporting Ukraine, and it has an effect also on the refugee and migration crisis that Europe is facing now. And you can see the energy crisis is about roughly $1 trillion. And obviously we don't know where it is going to end because nobody is expected. I mean, the prices are still high when we're talking about energy, but they went back somehow from the peak last year, when it peaked last year in August. But this year is going to be very different. Europe and the global community was really lucky as the winter was warm. And that was it. That was just mere luck. If the winter was really cold, how it was supposed to be, or everybody expected, it might have triggered another refugee crisis as Europe was preparing for. It didn't happen, but there are no other explanation, but just simply the winter was warm. And the European Union member states and the global community cannot really rely on such an unpredictable factor as the weather. So, and there are other issues that are going to influence how the energy crisis is going to turn out and how it is going to influence the end outcome as well. The competition for tankers, for the fuel as well, for example. There are just simply not enough vessels. And the infrastructure in Europe also is pretty critical, because even though Europe can buy enough LNG, let's say from the United States, however, the US has mainly long-term contracts, and it needs to deliver the LNG to Asia, and let's say the demand is going to come back pre-COVID to pre-COVID level. Then the US needs to redirect the LNG to Asia, and Europe is going to suffer. And it is, again, I have to repeat, it's a war of attrition. You just have to think that the European Union imported over 40% of its energy needs from Russia. It cannot be replaced from one day to another. It's not like, especially when we're talking about Lego pipelines. It's not like a Lego that you just take it out and just put it somewhere else. It just cannot be built. Same with the LNG terminals. However, there are cases, especially in Germany, when it was built in 6 to 8 months. This is remarkable, but it just doesn't happen every day. And even though there is an LNG terminal, we are still talking about regasification. So there are lots of issues with energy supply and replacing the Russian energy sources. So, but if we are looking at the worst case scenario, there is still going to be a gap for this summer. So if there's going to be a cold winter and the Russian flow is going to halt, it's going to be zero, and Asia is going to, in Asia the demand is going to spike up again, then Europe is going to be in really a trouble. And most probably the questions that were posed over the summer last year, it's going to come up again. That how much does it cost to support Ukraine? Why do we need to get refugees? So it's really and highly related, because it affects people's everyday life. But I don't want to close the panel with such a sad prediction, or not even prediction, but thoughts that most of the policymakers are saying. This is a brand new survey from the European Union, and you can see that Europe still stands strong, even though it costs a lot, and in most of the countries the energy bills tripled, doubled, quadrupled, and most of the people around me, I am from Hungary, Budapest, had multiple families in their own home welcoming people from refugees from Ukraine. And even though we had to pay, I don't know, quadruple price of the fuel, we were apparently still happy to do that, and all across in the member states. So as you can see, 91% of Europeans approve of providing humanitarian support to Ukraine. To be honest, it's never been a debate. I mean, Europe is pretty diverse. Each and every member state has its own agenda, national interest. Its background is different, its culture is different, its language is different. But at the end of the day, all these decisions and all that money, all the 67 billion euro had to be voted unanimously. That means that all 27 countries had to vote yes. And they did vote yes, regardless of the political agenda or the opinion or the national interest. The same thing, 74% of EU citizens approve economic sanctions against Russia. 88% of Europeans are in favor of welcoming Ukrainians fleeing the war into the EU. So whatever predictions we can read or we can hear, or it might seem like doomsday predictions, Europe is still standing strong behind Ukraine and supporting refugees coming to the European Union, and apparently happy to pay even more than 67 billion euros to finance the cost of the refugee crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mónika. I believe our next speaker will be Nayla Rush. Let me pull up. I'm going to be working for Nayla today. There we go. Okay.
Hi everybody, and thanks for being here, and thanks for staying. So as Mónika said, I'm going to talk about the US response to the Ukrainian crisis. I will probably be repeating some info you've heard, but we don't exchange notes, so that's quite normal. So this presentation, it's based on a number of reports that I've written on the subject. You can see, and you can find it on the website later on. So this is going to be a quick overview here. Before I go to the US front, here's some background on the European response. We've all mentioned now the historic decision by the EU to give TP, which entails residence permit, access to employment, housing, social welfare, medical treatment, education, etc. And it was initially decided to give it for 1 year, like this. It was initially decided to give it for 1 year, but it was then extended to at least March 2024. And also, what's interesting, that in a move to encourage returns, it was announced that those who decide to return home will not lose the status, because many were reluctant to go back in the fear of losing the status and then having to flee again. So that kind of encouraged those who wanted to go, and they will not lose any benefit. It's also important to underline there is no legal ground for distribution of Ukrainian refugees among EU member states, which means that onward migration here follows personal initiatives. Now, onward migration usually depends on welcoming policies and protection, but also on diaspora and economic opportunities. So Ukrainian refugees choose the country they want to settle in and ask for temporary protection. For example, of the 9+ million who fled to Poland, only 1.5 applied for TP there. Now, before I go to the next slide, a few heads up. Most of the Ukrainians who sought protection in countries in Europe do not hold refugee status. We call them refugees, but they did not ask for asylum, nor were they granted refugee status. Obviously, they would be entitled for one, but the TP process was designed to expedite admission and protection for them. We will see a parallel in the US, as most Ukrainians are being admitted here not under the traditional refugee resettlement program, i.e. not as refugees, but under the newly designed Uniting for Ukraine program as parolees. I'll get to the difference between the two in a bit. One last point. Ukrainians admitted to the US are generally not fleeing a country of war, but are coming from Europe where they have been granted protection. So let's go to slide 4 and let's look at some of the numbers in Ukraine. Probably you've seen that, so I will not go through one by one, but from the 8 million Ukrainians who fled, 5 million registered for TP, Why this discrepancy? Well, some 3 million went to non-EU countries where there is no TP. For example, 2.8 million refugees from Ukraine were recorded in Russia and Belarus. And one last number, only 25,000 applied for asylum in the EU. These numbers are from June 2022. So again, it's not asylum, it's another form of protection. Now, the US response. The United States' initial response towards people fleeing Ukraine was to provide them with economic and humanitarian assistance where they are, i.e. in countries they fled to in Europe. Secretary of State Blinken said early on, most who fled Ukraine want to stay close to home, hoping to be able to return as soon as possible. And accordingly, the State Department's initial response was to only consider for resettlement into the United States Ukrainians who are unsafe in the countries they fled to, which is, in a sense, what the refugee resettlement program stands for, to resettle people who are unsafe in the countries they fled to. Let me take a couple of minutes on this US refugee resettlement program. It was created following the Refugee Act of 1980 to provide a uniform procedure for refugee admissions and authorize federal assistance to resettle refugees after they come here. The aim was to end an ad hoc approach to refugee admissions that had characterized US refugee policy since World War II. So what's resettlement? Resettlement is the transfer of refugee from an asylum country to another country that has agreed to admit them and grant them permanent status. In the US, for example, a refugee has to apply for a green card. It's not a choice. By law, he has to apply for a green card 1 year after admission. And afterwards, obviously, get citizenship if they want to. Now we have 21 million refugees under UNHCR's mandate today. Obviously, not all can be resettled, nor all need to be resettled. So resettlement is a critical lifeline for refugees who cannot return home and cannot reside safely in the country to which they fled to. According to the UN Refugee Agency, only 2 million are in need of resettlement in 2023. And out of those 2 million, only a small proportion of refugees will end up being resettled, whether in the US or other country. So just to put things into perspective. The annual number of refugees under the resettlement program to be admitted into the US is set by the President every fiscal year after consultation with Congress. It's called the ceiling. President Biden set this year's ceiling to 125,000, same as last year. Now, under a ceiling on 125,000 refugees, only 500 were resettled. That's last year. So far this year, until end of January, 9,240 refugees. So why these low numbers? There are numerous reasons for that. But the US resettlement program is a long process. It doesn't happen overnight. And moreover, the program has been diverting its resources to various new categories of people coming, including border crossers, but also to Afghan and Ukrainian parolees, which further slows the system because these resources are being used elsewhere. One more point about what was mentioned earlier about granting citizenship to Ukrainian parolees. The US is already giving temporary protection under the assumption that the crisis will end at one point and that Ukrainians will want to return. Meanwhile, what it has done is provide them with assistance while they are here. Also, remember that Ukrainian parolees can adjust their status by claiming asylum or through their employment or family members here. But the main issue here is the path to citizenship for Ukrainian already exists. They can come as refugees through the US refugee resettlement program, and as mentioned before, become green card holders very fast. Now, these admissions have been low through this program, and maybe we can start there, use the existing systems that offers already a durable solution. Let's move to the Lautenberg Amendment, which is a program that resettled refugees use to come to the US under the refugee resettlement program. That program started in the early 1990s to give safe havens to religious minorities who were being persecuted in the Soviet Union. It gives direct access to Ukrainians who can apply from Ukraine. They don't need to be in an asylum country to join family members in the US who preceded them. It kind of produced chain migration as first comers filled affidavits, I can't pronounce that, of relationship for relatives to join them, provided they belong to the same religious minority group said to be in need of protection under the amendment. Now, this lifeline for persecuted religious minority groups from the former Soviet Union, including Ukraine, to reunite for their family members in the US lost its raison d'etre, but it continues on automatic pilot. It is used today to resettle Ukrainians fleeing a war zone and not religious persecution. In the past decade or so, some 20,000 Ukrainian refugees were resettled here under this amendment. So let's move to the admissions of Ukrainians in the US since the beginning of the crisis. 100,000 came under Uniting for Ukraine. I'll talk about the program later. Some 38,000 have been already approved and are awaiting travel. Now those, as we said, are admitted as parolees. 1,658 came under the refugee resettlement program as refugees. What's the difference? Again, the process to resettle refugees here takes time, 18 to 24 months. On average, the resettlement program offers a durable solution, and they are provided with multiple federal benefits upon arrival and beyond to help them integrate. Parole, on the other hand, is quick. It's just an official permission to enter and remain temporarily in the US. Ukrainians were granted a 2-year parole, renewable. And parole has limited access to benefits. But bills were passed by Congress to give Ukrainian parolees only the same federal assistance as resettled refugees. Another number, some 30,000, were encountered at the border crossing from Mexico. So these numbers are just listed. These newcomers add on to the existing immigrant community of 350,000 Ukrainians already here. These numbers are important because we know that diaspora attracts migration. What measures has the US government taken towards this Ukrainian crisis? First, increase this refugee resettlement process under the Lautenberg Amendment and broaden access to visa processing and at consular posts overseas. Second, give TPS, which is temporary protected status, it's not the same as the EU one, to Ukrainians already living in the US. What this means is that they cannot be deported if they are ordered deported, and they can work here. Also, Ukrainians were allowed to cross the southern border to seek asylum despite Title 42, which we all probably heard about. That's a public health order instituted by the CDC at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, what the U.S. government says that you cannot cross, but if you're Ukrainian, you can cross and claim asylum. Now, Title 42 is now under a legal battle, but it's still ongoing, and it's still applied for Ukrainians. Another thing Congress did was to create an expedited asylum process for Ukrainian parolees. So a Ukrainian parolee who has come here, whether through the border or through Uniting for Ukraine, can ask for asylum, and that process will be faster than for others. Another advantage, parolees in general may apply for work authorization, meaning they come here, they apply for work authorization, they wait, they pay for it. What the US government did for Ukrainian parolees is waive all this and treat them as they were refugees, meaning a refugee automatically has an employment authorization from day one, and they do not pay for that. Other benefits were introduced. And these, I think, are really important and many people don't know about. Like I said before, parolees have limited access to benefits. Refugees have access to a whole number of benefits. What the US government did was give Ukrainian parolees the same benefits as a refugee. There are numerous. You have employment training, English language, job placement, cash, support with housing, community orientation, accessing health services, enrollment in other benefits and welfare programs, etc. So all this was done. And, as we just all heard about, was the launching of the program called Uniting for Ukraine. One number, maybe Mónika will be interested with that figure. The US Congress has approved more than $113 billion of aid and military assistance to support Ukraine and allied nations, of which $6.6 billion go to refugees, Ukrainian refugees, whether here or abroad. So a couple of words about Uniting for Ukraine. It has been presented to us as a private sponsorship program. And it's supposed to be a quick pathway to bring Ukrainians straight from Europe to the US. How does it work? First, the process must be initiated by a US-based supporter or sponsor. Somebody from the US has to ask for the Ukrainian to come here. Ukrainians abroad cannot directly apply for parole under this program. So you have a US-based sponsor, who, by the way, does not need to be a US citizen or even a green card holder. Asylees, meaning those granted asylum in the US, refugees, parolees, GPS holders, beneficiary of deferred action, including DACA, or deferred enforced departure, we call them DEDs, can also act as supporters under this program. So this US-based supporter agrees to provide Ukrainian beneficiary with financial support. But other people and other organizations, like resettlement agencies that are mostly funded by the government, can also offer financial support to facilitate admission. Moreover, Ukrainian parolees who came here and have access to federal funds can now sponsor other Ukrainians to be paroled in. So you can see that once again, a program that is introduced as private sponsorship is not totally private. Almost 200,000 Americans have applied to sponsor Ukrainians under this program. But 200,000 sponsors does not mean 200,000 Ukrainians, because one sponsor can bring multiple Ukrainians here. So we might end with twice, 2, 3, 4, 5 times the number of Ukrainians admitted. Remember, 100,000 already came, 38,000 are waiting to come. So let's wrap this up, because we all want to go home. Europe's economy is further challenged by millions of Ukrainians, refugees, and soaring energy prices. Mónika just talked about that. Integration capacity, the job market, education, the housing is close to reaching its limits. And we know that permanent return for the majority of Ukrainians is not on the agenda for now. Most returns, we call them pendular, meaning they are back and forth movements to visit family, get supplies, or even help other relatives leave Ukraine. So as the conflict stretches in time and space, Ukrainians could find non-European countries, including the US, more and more attractive. And with Uniting for Ukraine that is expediting a process, we should expect many more Ukrainians to come here. But as the Ukrainian crisis stretches in time and space, a shift is needed from crisis management that I feel it was happening and short-term measures to long-term policy and support. Oxford refugee scholar Betts and economic scholar Paul Collier wrote a book about refugees and how to really help refugees. One sentence comes to mind. They say, help refugees help themselves. Refugees need jobs. They do not want handouts. And what's interesting is that with this in mind, the US government set up a new public-private initiative and signed a Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, with 10 Partnership for Refugees to support employment opportunities and economic integration for refugees worldwide. What is TENT? It's a business coalition made up of more than 300 multinational companies committing to support refugees through hiring, training, and mentorship. What's important is giving refugees a job and not just handouts. This partnership seeks to mobilize US and international businesses and corporations to connect refugees to work opportunities. And let's not forget, it underlines the importance of shared responsibility, which is one of the main ideas behind the United Nations Global Compact on Refugees. To conclude, I would like to take a step back and perhaps offer some perspective. Millions of Ukrainians, as we saw, fled their country to Europe and beyond. To avoid overwhelming the system, the standard asylum system, and for faster protection rights, the EU decided to give them a temporary protection. Across the Atlantic, the US government launched a streamlined process called Uniting for the Ukraine to offer Ukrainians a chance to come quickly to the United States under parole, outside the regular refugee resettlement program. This parallelism is interesting. It both offered outside the regular system fast and efficient protection models. This is quite telling, I think, about the current refugee system, which perhaps is becoming obsolete. If, with every crisis, alternative pathways are needed to expedite admission and protection, then perhaps the system needs revising. With that, I will end. Thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions.
just evidence you're still younger than I am.
Okay. So, I am here to talk about the Connecticut for Ukraine Refugee Matching Program. My name is Dana Bucin, and I am the Honorary Consul of Romania to Connecticut. I'm a private immigration lawyer, a partner at North Carolina. And when the war broke out, I was in the United States minding my private lawyer business. When I saw on TV the valiant efforts of my Romanian compatriots to help Ukrainian refugees that were pouring into Romania's borders on day 1 and day 2. And at that point in time, no organization or government or nonprofit or NGO was able to mobilize that fast. So what I saw, and that inspired me to this day, were the efforts of ordinary Romanian citizens lining up for miles at the border with cars to pick up Ukrainian refugees, to house them and feed them in their own homes. And that is the basic inspiration for this program. Now, I yearned to be in Romania at the border with Ukraine at that time. I am originally born and raised in Romania, immigrated here about 25 years ago. And I wanted to be in Romania at the border with my compatriots to assist refugees, but I couldn't because such is the business of law. You have to stay here and do it here in the United States. And I figured that if I were going to go to Romania to help, I wasn't going to come back. So I was going to stay there and help. So instead, what ended up happening is we assisted Ukrainian refugees from the United States who were brought to our attention through various connections. People said, Dana, we have a friend who's trying to escape Kiev or who's trying to escape Ukraine. And you're from Romania. Don't you have someone in Romania who could help them? Absolutely. So friends, I got to tell you that everybody who knows me in Romania cursed the day they knew me because I parked a bunch of Ukrainian refugees all over my friends' houses. My own family hosted about 5 or 6 refugees in my home at various times. My neighbors and friends, of course, they were in it too. I mobilized my municipality, my grandparents' municipalities. So in any way, that's what I could do from the United States. But then I noticed that they kept coming to the United States at the Mexican border. Now, why would they come to the Mexican border? Why would we have a budding humanitarian disaster at the US-Mexican border from March to late April 2022, you might ask? The prior speaker excellently pointed out why. It's because we have an antiquated refugee asylee system in the US policies that takes 18 to 24 months, optimistically, to resettle refugees to the United States. And it's absolutely inapt and inadequate for an emergency, such as the Ukrainian war. It's been tested during the Afghan crisis, and it's been found completely inadequate. And so here we are faced with a second emergency in the United States and not knowing how to deal with it. So now, of course, these Ukrainian folks who had nowhere else to go, they had no relatives in Europe, they came to the United States because this is where there was someone they knew. A family, a friend, someone. So they crashed at the US border, Tijuana-San Diego checkpoint, and for a period of 6 weeks, the government of the United States finally found a temporary solution, an emergency solution to let them in despite Title 42, which was a public health measure. And so they carved out an exception for 6 weeks to only allow in Ukrainians. When I saw on TV that there were large groups of Ukrainians crashing in the bushes of Tijuana, it was a forming humanitarian disaster that even the Mexican government recognized it as such, so they opened an entire stadium to Ukrainian refugees there. So I saw that on TV and I said, that's it. I couldn't go to Romania, but I'm definitely going to Mexico to help these people. They're at a border near me. So they're my neighbors in Romania, and now they're at my door. And so I'm going to do whatever I can to help them. So I flew to Tijuana, Mexico. Never been to Mexico before. But, and another crazy immigration lawyer who heard me posting, saw my postings on social media, said she's coming with. So together we flew to Tijuana, actually to San Diego, and we crossed over by foot into Tijuana, into Mexico, and there we went to this big stadium that hosted all these Ukrainian refugees. And so what you're about to see are some photos, because they speak way more than words about the situation on the ground. So, photos. By the way, you're seeing the Facebook page, to which I invite all of you to give a like, because you're going to get news and alerts about what we do for the program. This is the outcome, the final outcome of after we crossed over these folks. And you're seeing two of the refugees that came back with me to Connecticut. I wanted to see some of the conditions on the ground. So I went there prepared to speak some Ukrainian through an app. I learned Ukrainian on an app, very little, just enough to be able to understand what people are asking me. But when I showed up there, turns out that the more spoken language at the US-Mexico border, for some reason, was Romanian. Why? Because the volunteers who were helping these people were Romanian speakers and Moldovans who spoke Romanian / Moldovan, depending on what side of the Romanian and Moldovan are the same language. And so you're looking at two volunteers who spoke Romanian. And so I didn't even have to use my Ukrainian, because all the volunteers spoke Romanian to me. And there were a lot of Ukrainian refugees from the Bucovina part of Ukraine who also spoke Romanian to me. And so I dealt a lot in Romanian, didn't get to practice my Ukrainian, but here it is. We had to form connections with Border Patrol, because here are the issues. At a border checkpoint, okay, Border Patrol is king, unfortunately. They're kings. They could even not refuse to allow me to deal on behalf of the refugees with them. They could, and many times they yelled at me to get out of the way, to go back. And so I decided to be friends with them rather than be yelled at. And so this is what I did in order to be able to pass about 2,000 refugees from Mexico into the United States legally on humanitarian parole, which was the only way they could get in at that point in time between March 11 and April 25. We were the only two immigration lawyers at the border, so I want you to see our faces. There we are, me and my colleague. I've kept that badge since then, and I've wore it all around Mexico and all around at the border, and I got stopped every single time because of it, which was fine. One time it saved us from getting lost in Tijuana, so I'm grateful for it. All right, and then I wanted to tell you, I wanted to show you the conditions at the border. So this is the camp in Tijuana, in a stadium, where thousands, as my prior speaker pointed out, over 30,000 people lived in this camp at different times, not all at once, during the 6 weeks at the border that they had to pass through. Now, issues at the border that I had to deal with is the fact that only Ukrainian nationals were allowed to pass through this special streamlined checkpoint, not Russians, not Moldovans, and there were a lot of Moldovans that came through, wanted to pass through the border. The only exceptions they made, and they made it under my nose right there while I was at the border, was for spouses of Ukrainians. They didn't want to allow any other nationalities, but they made exceptions for people who could prove they were legally married or legally related as parent and child. And so documentation all of a sudden became very important. But what do you do when the war burned all your documentation and you couldn't prove your relationship? So those were issues that I had to deal with as a lawyer on call at that time. Everybody came to my legal table. I'm going to show you the legal table that I stayed at. And people told us, there are problems with documentations. And some problems are more stringent than others. So if you cannot prove being related to a Ukrainian, you have no business entering through that border checkpoint. So that's very important too. Unaccompanied minors. We just heard about human trafficking concerns, and I was not about to let anyone be trafficked into the United States. So I was very careful at watching who's related to who, what documentation they could provide towards that purpose. And I have to say it was very painful because on many occasions I faced unaccompanied minors specifically from Mariupol. And they were there telling us that listen, my parents are not able, we don't know where they are, we have no idea if they survived. They showed me photos of their bombed house, and it was a very hard decision to make, what to do with them. And I knew that even if they were going to be allowed into the United States, they were going to be first detained for about a month by ORR, just to figure out what's going on. Who do they belong to? Who are their parents? Where are their parents? Because of the human trafficking concerns. So those are other types of issues that we faced. Other issues we faced were related to the bureaucracy, as justified as it sometimes is at the border with, for example, not even allowing US citizens in, or spouses of US citizens. So God forbid you are a dual Ukrainian and US citizen, which sometimes happens, despite the fact that Ukraine doesn't usually tolerate second citizenship. But there were cases of Ukrainian citizens who had both a Ukrainian and a US passport, and they came married to Moldovans. Okay, so now, because one of the spouses was a US citizen, they were not allowed, their spouse, the Moldovan, was not allowed through that border checkpoint. Because, you know what, go through the bureaucratic channels, which take 18 plus months to get a green card through a US consulate abroad. And so those were the difficult situations that we had to navigate. On more than one occasion, I had to yell at the Border Patrol, they yelled back at me. But in the end, we settled our dispute, and they were allowed under a legal way. Some of them took two attempts, others took 3 attempts, but we passed about 2,000 of them during the 4 days that I was there. Okay, so now we came back to Connecticut, and I want to show you the 3 refugees that came back with me to Connecticut. And that was the birth of our Connecticut for Ukraine refugee matching program. There they are in the airport. So you're looking at what inspired the program. As soon as I got back, I said, all right, so I'm back to my private lawyer business. I'm done. I'm happy I helped 2,000 refugees. I'm done. But no. The people back at the camp, which didn't close just because Dana Bucin left it, were calling me like crazy. I was still the lawyer on call to decide and triage. And let me tell you, that's not easy. It's not easy to triage who makes it and who doesn't make it into the United States. So my idea of triage was to allow as many as I could legally allow, and then some who could legally argue their way through. So I was one of those people who just allowed a lot of people in. And so I was on call, and they said, Dana, there's so many other Ukrainians who need you, and they need a sponsor. They need someone to stay with. Now, these 3 refugees that you see in the photo were immediately matched by the grace of the Ukrainian American community, Father Andriy in New Britain, who came and met us at the airport and took over the 3 refugees, matched them with Connecticut sponsors, and boom, it was done. But what about the others in the camps? And what about after the camp closed on April 25 to make room for Connecticut for United for Ukraine new program? After the camp closed, they moved the entire Tijuana operation in Mexico City. And that camp was way worse than Tijuana camp, if you can imagine such a condition, because you saw how it looked. The one in Mexico City was awful. And so I felt a duty to help extract all the Ukrainians out of that camp and match them with Connecticut sponsors. And word got around that I had a knack at matching people with sponsors. And so at the same time, sponsors were reaching out to me because they saw an article in the news about how I landed at the airport with refugees, and I've been helping refugees, and they want to help. They want to house Ukrainian refugees. And so I had a matching thing on my hands. I didn't want to do it. I wanted some other nonprofit to do it. But as is true of everyone, nonprofits were overwhelmed and unable to do it. They didn't have the funding. They didn't have the time to fundraise, et cetera, employ people for this. So it befell me to do it. So I've started this matching service through the honorary consulate of Romania to Connecticut. And I mobilized the Romanian community to help me. So they helped me by developing matching forms, pre-screening forms that would extract data from Ukrainians and Connecticut sponsors under different categories, and they would and that's how we would figure out who's a good match for whom. And we did that before Welcome.us announced their matching service. And now there is Welcome.us, thank God. However, the 300 plus Ukrainian families who are still waiting to be matched through us haven't been able to locate sponsors yet, not even through Welcome.us. And so, if you're in the room and thinking about how you could help, there's a very simple way. Go to the Facebook page or go to our website, cityukraine.org, and spread the word that whoever has any free housing in Connecticut should consider hosting a Ukrainian refugee family. And it's very simple. We advise, and that's only because we learned from refugee resettlement agencies such as IRIS, who's here with us, and SIRI, I believe, is also here with us, right? We learned from them, and we learned that the first 6 months are critical. So if you could offer free housing for at least 6 months to a Ukrainian family, that will give them enough time to get here, get a social security number, a work permit, a driver's license, and become self-sufficient in 6 months. So that's what we're asking. Free housing for 6 months in Connecticut, and there's 300 plus Ukrainians waiting in Ukraine and other camps in Europe to relocate specifically to Connecticut, because of course we brag about Connecticut on our page and why they should come to us. There's actually a thing called Why Connecticut on our website. Next, I want to take this opportunity to mention the other agencies who are doing the valuable work of supporting Ukrainian refugees after we've matched them, because make no mistake, we match them and that's all we do. The hard work of helping Ukrainians to, with English lessons, job placements, benefits, health insurance, all the other stuff befalls on IRIS, Integrated Refugee and Immigration Services, SIRI, Connecticut Immigrants and Refugee Institute. There's also folks from CIRC here, Connecticut Immigrant and Refugee Coalition, and Jewish Family Services as well. So these folks are absolutely amazing because they actually do the hard work. I just do the matching. There's also other Ukrainian organizations in this room that asked me to mention them. Moja Ukraina has pamphlets at the exit. Please pick some on your way out. And if I'm forgetting, I see. Okay, hello, there they are. And others will be given the opportunity to speak during the question and answer session. Now, I want to take the opportunity to introduce 3 Ukrainian refugees who are going to give you the real voices of this displacement crisis. And the first one is from Kiev, Elena Kruzalova. The second one is from Bucha, and the third one from Mariupol. And I want you to listen to them so that you could sense what this conflict does to people at a human, personal level. Thank you so much for your attention.
Come on down. Yeah. I told my mom when I grow up I want to be Dana Bucin. I need a red cape and a...
Thank you very much. It's a real honor for me to speak to such a distinguished group today. As a native Ukrainian, as a very recent Ukrainian immigrant to America, I'm especially grateful to your great efforts to support and defend my countrymen and women in the United States, in Eastern Europe, and the worldwide. I have been in the United States for a little over 2 months. My encounter with the war in Ukraine began in Kiev, the early morning of the February of 24th, almost exactly a year ago today. Despite Western media warnings and troubling forebodings, it was still very unexpected to hear the sounds of bombing at 6 a.m. Unfortunately, I had a similar experience 9 years earlier when my daughter and I, we were living in Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. Our beautiful city was attacked by Russian separatists and we were forced to flee to the west to start a new life in Kiev. So I'm a refugee twice over from my own homeland. Last February, at the outset of the war and in the face of danger and much uncertainty, most Ukrainians had to decide whether to stay in their homes or to flee to the west of Ukraine and further into Europe. My daughter and I and a few of our relatives were among those who decided to escape from the war, especially as street fighting had already broken out in some parts of Kiev. And no one knew at that moment how events would unfold. We spent 1 week in hiding in Cherkasy until we were able to find the least dangerous way to cross the border. We decided to drive 14 hours to the Moldovan border and then into Romania. During this time, we had heard from friends and from the media about requirement for border crossing and also available help for refugees in border countries. But we were very surprised. Indeed, we were overwhelmed by the warm reception we received in Romania. Immediately after crossing the border, we were met by volunteers, and they were very helpful and welcoming. It was late at night when we arrived, but everything was perfectly organized. And it was only maybe 10 days after the beginning of the war. We were given hot meals and settled into a lovely house The owner of the house was in contact with the volunteers and many other local residents who were ready to help Ukrainians at any time, day or night. The kindness and generosity of our Romanian hosts were amazing and heartwarming. In many instances, we were not even allowed to pay for goods and services. But most of all, on behalf of my family and myself, I need to express my gratitude to Dana Bucin and to her family in Transylvania. They welcomed us into their home and if we were their own family members. And for several weeks they took care of our every need as we began to recover from our trauma of our experience and to make new plans. Later in March in Paris, I was reunited with my fiancé, Brian Callahan, who is an American citizen. Brian's good friend Peter Kelly had introduced us to Dana, who is Peter's former law partner, and together they orchestrated our flight to safety and to freedom. In Donetsk and in Kiev, I studied psychology and trained as a therapist, specializing for many years in counseling women and couples. And today I have begun counseling recent Ukrainian refugees here in the USA, many of whom have been traumatized by their recent experiences. I welcome this opportunity to help my fellow Ukrainians and to return the kindness and generosity shown to me by so many of you. In June, Brian and I were married in France, while Dana and her law partners worked tirelessly to secure my immigrant visa to the United States. We arrived to the United States in December. We are living in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. I'm safe and secure in my new adopted country. I am married to the man I love, I have a green card, and I have a new life. This is my story. Thank you very much.
Is Natalia Hoyduk in the crowd? And I would like to, there she is. She's from Bucha, and we need a Ukrainian English interpreter. Artem, can you do it, or should I get someone else? Okay. Come, Natalia. She's going to share a few minutes about her experience escaping Bucha and coming to the United States. Okay.
Добрый день.
Okay, firstly, I just want to say sorry about my English, because I'm here like for 10 months and I'll try my best. Okay, thank you.
Я буду говорить по-русски, потому что росла в семье, где мама была русская, папа украинец.
I'll speak Russian, because I was born in a family where my mom were from Russia and my dad were from Ukraine.
И у нас никогда в стране, в Украине, не было притеснения к тем людям, которые говорят на русском языке.
And in our country, never was a pressure for those who speak Russian. Yeah.
И когда я приехала в Америку, и мы заговорили за войну, а мне сказали, у вас не война, а у вас освободительная операция.
And when we came to the United States, and my mom said that we came from the war, and someone tell her that it's not a war, it's like operation for freedom, to freedom Ukrainians.
Я сказала, а от чего меня освободили? Я спросила у людей, а от чего меня освободили? Русские.
And I asked them what freedom they came to give.
От моей работы,
From my work,
от моей семьи,
from my family,
от моих друзей,
from my friends,
от моей квартиры,
from my apartment,
от моей церкви.
from my church.
Просила ли я русских освободить меня от этого? И миллионы, больше 40 миллионов украинцев, просили ли они такой свободы, этого освобождения?
Am I asked Russian soldiers to get me from this and other a lot of Ukrainians?
Но они добились, они освободили так, что я теперь боюсь возвращаться в Украину.
Yeah, and they did it the way that now my mom, she's scared to come back to Ukraine.
Потому что то, что происходило там, пока я была с начала войны, с 24 февраля до 5 марта, я пережила очень много беды и горя.
Because there was a lot of happens, as we know, we're from Bucha, and my mom, she was under Russian occupation. There was a lot of really bad things happened.
Мой сын, он выехал в первый день войны.
I was go to Poland in the first day of war.
И он мне звонил и просил, чтобы мама, выезжай тоже.
And I called my mom and asked her, Mom, please come to us.
И я не могла выехать в первый день войны, потому что у нас не все люди выехали сразу. Буча — это где-то до 40 тысяч людей.
And I wasn't able to come to my son, that is me, yeah, and because there was a lot of people who can't get out of there. There is like 40,000 of people.
Очень много людей выехало, осталось меньше 10 тысяч. Ну, выезжало в эти дни даже. Да.
In a few first days, a lot of thousands people came out there, and there was like about 10,000 people who stayed there in Bucha.
Потому что люди, они, ну, нас предупреждали, что война будет, но мы не могли все равно до конца в это поверить.
A lot of people and government was saying there war will be, but we can't even imagine it in it and believe in it.
И когда выезжали люди, я живу, мой дом, он на трассе, которая идет в сторону Польши. Мои окна выходят на трассу.
And we used to live in a house that really close to the highway that goes straight to Poland.
И знаете, я видела много своими глазами, как люди, которые выезжали, даже тогда, когда давали зеленый коридор.
And I saw people who came out from Bucha, even where there was a green, humanitarian corridor.
Их просто расстреливали, машины их расстреливали.
The Russian military was destroyed them.
И поэтому я тоже боялась,
выезжать.
And I also was scared to get out from there.
Но сын просил меня выехать,
But my son asked me to get out from there.
потому что там оставалось, выехать все-таки было безопаснее, чем оставаться.
Because, again, get out from there, it was more safety than to stay there.
И мы, русские войска, стояли на параллельной улице, уже потому что я живу на окраине Бучи.
So, and the Russian military was pretty close to us, like on a near street.
А в центре Бучи группировались машины на выезд.
In the center of our city, in Bucha, there was cars, buses that will get out from Bucha and going to the border.
Потому что люди, там был штаб, и там туда сходили все сообщения, люди местные, они сообщали, куда заходят русские войска. Ну, где они группируются, в каких частях Бучи. Команда, которая была в центре.
Oh, okay. So, and then there in the center of the city, there were based a team who was telling where the Russian military right now and which way we can get out from there.
Но меня уже туда не выпускали, так как я говорю, что они стояли на параллельной совсем рядом улице и через трассу.
And
Войска.
the Ukrainian military was not allow my mom to get to the center of the city because the Russian military was pretty close to her.
И тероборона, которая нас охраняла там в бомбоубежищах, но я была на первом этаже.
And
Ну, всех наших людей нас
okay,
охраняла.
so and close to our home, there was our Ukrainian military, and they were they were keeping us in safetyness, and they were protect us.
Они не разрешали выходить мне, потому что наш дом они заблокировали, чтобы русские не ворвались в наш дом, потому что они заходили в дома и заезжали танками прямо в дома
And
частные.
And our military, Ukrainian military, was not allowed my moms to get out because Russian military, even in the tanks, were going straight into the house and destroyed them.
Но я понимала, что мне надо выйти. Но я боялась выйти очень, потому что стреляли. И я попросила, чтобы все-таки мне навстречу прислали машину мои друзья. Приехали и забрали меня из центра Бучи до моего дома.
And I knew that I need to get out from there, and I asked for my friends who were in center of Bucha to go in the car to me and take me from there.
И когда я сказала теробороне, что за мной сейчас приедет машина,
And when I said to Ukrainian military that for me that I'm waiting for car,
они сказали, что сюда никто не может приехать и отсюда никто не может выйти, потому что стреляют все время.
and they said me that no one can get into here and get out to here because Russian military is always shooting in everyone.
Но я сказала, мой Бог меня выведет.
But I said, my God will help me to get out from here.
И когда подъехала машина, они не ожидали, что... Они закричали, какого цвета машина?
And when the car came to our, they was not expected to see the car. They they said, which color is your car?
Я сказала, это серое Рено.
It's gray Renault.
Они говорят, быстро собирай, быстро бери свои вещи, мы откроем, сейчас отодвинем двери, чтобы ты выскочила.
So they told me, took your things, took your clothes real quick. We'll open the door for you to get out.
Но у меня вещей не было, у меня были только документы, потому что я не могла взять большую сумку, я взяла только документы.
I haven't the clothes or things. All that I have, it's just my documents, because I was not able to take a bag or something.
Да, потому что я знала, понимала, что мне, может, где-то придется бежать, и поэтому я не брала груза никакого.
Because I knew that somewhere maybe I'll need to run. That's why I did not took the bag with me.
И когда они открыли двери, я села в машину.
They opened the door for me, and I was sitting in a car.
Мы поехали по этой прямой улице до нашего, вот где штаб этот был, до центра мэрии.
And we went to the center of our city.
И мы все время ехали вот так, прижимаясь в машине, но мы вжимали плечи, потому что стреляли. Вроде бы это нам поможет.
And we were kind of like hiding because Russian military was shooting, and we thought that it will help us.
Нас вывозили на Западную Украину, в Ровно.
The car was going to Rovno.
И чтобы доехать от Бучи до Ровно, это, я думаю, где-то 2,5 часа.
To get from Bucha to Rovno, it's about like 2.5 hours.
Но мы ехали 7,5 часов.
But it took 7.5 hours.
Потому что нам нужно было объехать, между домами, эти русские, где стояли войска, где стояли танки и бронемашины их, мы объезжали долго, и трассы, где были разбитые, поэтому так долго мы ехали.
And it took a lot of time because we went through the ways where was not based Russian military and was good roads, because a lot of roads were destroyed and there is no way to get through it.
И знаете, я же говорю, что русские добились своего, что я боюсь, у меня 2 месяца где-то было очень тяжело вообще, я не могла ни спать, ни кушать, потому что было очень тяжело, эти воспоминания, эти картинки перед глазами.
And first few months it was really hard for me to sleep, to eat, because all the way that I went through, it was really hard for me, and it was hard.
Я хочу сказать большое спасибо и президенту Байдену, и всем американцам, и правительству за помощь, которую они предоставляют.
And I want to say thank you to our President Biden and to all the Americans and other people who support him.
Всем людям. Хочу поблагодарить психолога Елену хочу поблагодарить, которая помогает, психотерапевт Лена и пастырь Токарев Василий, они помогают сейчас мне справляться с моими страхами и с моими переживаниями этими.
And also I want to say thank you to Yelena, who's helping my mom to to take easy everything of it, you know, and to Pastor Tokarev. And that's it, yeah. Thank you.
Yes, one of the aspects of the displacement crisis is the need for mental health services. And I understand enough Russian to know that she just thanked Elena Krusalova here, who's a psychotherapist in Ukraine. And that's one of the things we have to take care of. We want to make sure we license people like Elena to provide psychotherapy in Ukrainian. This is very needed by people who escaped war trauma, and they are in need of access to mental health services for anything from PTSD to all the range of issues that they develop in response to the war. And next, I want to introduce to you the writer of a book about escaping Mariupol, and she's going to strike you as speaking English like a native because because she is a native. However, she wrote this book in conjunction with a Ukrainian refugee from Mariupol who cannot address you directly for confidentiality concerns. There may be some members of her family who are still beyond enemy lines. And so she cannot reveal her identity, but here we have the writer of the book to tell us about her. Hi, Ann Howard.
Thank you, Dana. Yes, I'll keep it brief. I know everyone's probably getting hungry for supper. I came to first know Adoriana Marique, who really, this is her story. Over 20 years ago, when I was looking for a nanny to take care of our children when they were very young, at the time I was very busy with a law practice in Ohio. I'm an attorney. And we couldn't get the young woman that we wanted from Mariupol, Ukraine, to come over on a work visa, so we got a Polish nanny instead. But long story short, I stayed in touch with this woman, Ina, for over 20 years through correspondence. And Ina's little sister, Adoriana, remained in Mariupol with Ina. Ina eventually moved to Florida. She married an American. And when the war began on February 24th, I immediately contacted Ina and said, "How is your little sister, Adoriana?" And she said, "We have no idea if she's dead or alive. Her phone is not working." It turns out that Adoriana was hiding under a basement shelter in downtown Mariupol alongside over 200 other civilians. This book tells the story of her 5 weeks in that basement shelter. Rest assured, she's okay now. She told me her story from a hostel in the Czech Republic, and my husband and I sponsored her to come live with us in Connecticut, where she is just thriving. That's how we came about meeting Dana. I don't know a lot about immigration law, so I thought we'd expedite the process, and I couldn't believe how efficient Dana was in helping us to get Adoriana a work visa, a social security card. We went on to get her refugee benefits and her Husky benefits for medical and dental care. The dental is especially important because her teeth really suffered when she was underground. She had no toothbrush, no water, very little food. There was no medicine, and so now she has a lot of issues that the dentist in Connecticut is helping us to take care of. The conditions in that basement underground were absolutely horrific. Adoriana literally, it even gets me a little choked up, and by the way, that's why I'm talking to you today rather than Adoriana, because not only are we concerned about anonymity, her parents, a Russian father and a Ukrainian mother who've lived together for 40 years or so, they remain in Russian-occupied territory alongside her brother. So we need to be careful. But she also cannot talk to you today because of the extent of trauma that she experienced underground. She literally slept beside corpses When neighboring buildings fell to the ground around them, because the bombing was 24/7, and it was deafening bombing, and she could hear the fighting in the streets between the Russian and Ukrainian soldiers. And so when the neighboring buildings were bombed, the occupants that survived would run into the street and flee down into the shelter where Adoriana and the 200 other people were. And the people would try to help them. They would, she would try to treat them and medically help them. Fortunately, she took a paramedics course just a few months before the war. And also, fortunately, when you were talking about documents, she was wise enough to put aside all of her important government documents in a lockbox in her apartment. So when the first bombs fell, she grabbed her beloved husky dog, Yola, and took her husky down to the basement with all of her government documents. So she witnessed so much death. She witnessed indescribable suffering. After 5 weeks, she came out of the shelter, and she saw that Russia had razed Mariupol to the ground. It just looked like a apocalyptic type of landscape. And that is why I think it's so important that you read this book, Escape from Mariupol, because Western journalists aren't allowed in Mariupol, as you know. And we don't really know the horrors of what happened in Mariupol. Fortunately, we could see what happened in Bucin, but we don't know about Mariupol. Mariupol, Ukrainian officials say that an estimated 23,000 civilians died in Mariupol in the early months of Russia's invasion. So Adoriana witnessed a lot of that. And she witnessed Russian soldiers would pull branches that were fashioned as crosses out of the graves to erase any evidence of their crimes against humanity. She was ultimately, after 5 weeks underground, she was evacuated by Russian soldiers to Russian-occupied territory, where she was given the choice, either stay in Russian-occupied territory or go to a filtration camp in Russia. And she snuck out in the middle of the night and found a drive to central Ukraine, and thereafter she was free. So it's an important story, and I hope you read it. It's available on Amazon. I've also got them there, $15 a book. Please know that Adoriana gets all the proceeds of this book. And she hopes to enroll in the nursing program at Northwest Community College in the fall.
And I'm supposed to follow that. A sincere thank you. Thank you for all of you coming and sharing. It's not easy to share traumatic experiences, and we appreciate you sharing with us. And I hope that they inspire people to act and do something. We didn't get the chance. It's late. It's well past time. I'd like to. Shane Smith, where are you? Did you have to leave? Shane Smith is there. Myron, Carl, and the crew are over here. These are all people. Shane is doing things with children, going back and forth, considering another mission overseas to help children. Please talk to him, see how you can help. Please talk to Myron and the Veterans Association and see where they need help. Part of what we wanted to do today was announce some of the small things we're launching at Quinnipiac. We're going to be launching a scholarship, not a scholarship program, a Quinnipiac for Ukraine fund to help, because we want, in the end, to be able to help our students and our faculty go back over, help and rebuild, have people coming back this way. And so today, please do not put a penny into the Quinnipiac fund. Give it to these people. But after the war is over, please help us where we can get people back and forth, get the people back to retrain, and we would certainly appreciate any support. Additionally, Mónika, Krzysztof, a number of the people here today from the panels and from the connection of networks throughout Central Europe and the United States. We're forming what we're calling CERI, Central and East European Research Initiative, because there's just not enough research of the broad issues, migration, energy, economics, going around on this topic. And the idea is to be able to collect these scholars, not all in one place, virtually, get them together as needed, but to be able to publish quality information that's getting out there and hopefully in part combating some of this bad information that's out there. So I really appreciate everyone staying late. I appreciate you coming out in the snow. And I know you did it because of what's happening in Ukraine. And let's pray to God we are not meeting here next year. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.